Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Making Action Happen. I'm Sarah Blackhurst.
And I'm Brian McCain.
So we have a pretty interesting show, especially if you are working in any kind of local government or public policy space. And we do have a lot of listeners from outside of Colorado as well as in Colorado. And so this might show is going to be a benefit to everyone. What we're going to be talking about today is the American Recovery Plan.
American Rescue Plan.
Rescue Plan. Why do I keep saying recovery? The American Rescue Plan. I guess I want to think that we're recovering rather than being rescued.
Yeah.
That's my problem. So we're going to talk about that today. The guidelines just came out this week on the specifics of those. And so my immediate thought was to call up two of our colleagues, Action 22 colleagues, and that is John Swartout and Kevin Bommer. And so they're going to be on the show. They're starting to unpack the nuances of the particular guidelines. And so I wanted to say welcome to both of them today. John Swartout is from the Colorado Counties, Inc., or CCI, and Kevin Bommer is the executive director for the Colorado Municipal League, which is known affectionately around Colorado as CML. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate you coming on.
Yep, great. Glad to be here.
So before we get too far into this, I wanted to have you guys sort of introduce yourselves and introduce what your organizations do before we start to unpack some of what's going to be happening next with these funds, in particular, because I think some people don't know the impact of your associations.
Great. I'll go first. John Swartout, and I'm the executive director of Colorado Counties. Happy to be here. Colorado Counties is a statewide organization that represents and has been representing for more than 100 years the counties in Colorado. We currently represent 61 out of the 64 counties in Colorado, and we do advocacy on behalf of those counties. We do education and outreach, and we do whatever we can to support counties and county commissioners, especially when they come in and as a new commissioner, and we provide orientation. Basically, the folks that have been working at Colorado Counties have been there for more than 20 years at this point, and do everything we can to support counties, both at the Colorado legislature, at a federal level, and as well on education needs, other needs that they have. And we're a resource, and we provide information for them. So been doing it for a long time, and happy to be here.
Thanks, John. Kevin.
Yeah, Kevin Bommer. I'm the executive director of the Colorado Municipal League. Like CCI, CML is a member-based organization. We're made up of 270 of Colorado's municipalities. If anyone has a connection in Sheridan Lake, that'll get me at 100%. And if anyone knows where Sheridan Lake is, you get bonus points. CML, like CCI, is governed by a board elected by our membership, and our three primary functions are advocacy, information, and training. Advocacy primarily at the state level, and then through our partners at the National League of Cities at the federal level. And then advocacy or information and training for both our staff and elected officials in municipalities around the state. Our bread and butter is our annual conference, which we had to delay again. Well, we canceled it last year. We'll have it in September of this year, and that draws a pretty good chunk of municipal officials from around the state. And with that, hopefully in the fall, we'll be all back on track with all of our regular functions and meetings and trainings.
So this has been a pretty interesting year at the legislature. Before we jump into these guidelines, can you guys talk a little bit about some of the things that have been popping up for your association, both interesting and hopeful and a little bit crazy?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I start from the point that we work with CML a lot because of our core principles, and the biggest core principle is legislators that don't come from local government really don't necessarily understand how the state constitution works and how local government is essentially an extension of state government, and we're partners. And so we're always on guard for programs and legislation that asks us to do things and doesn't pay for them. So unfunded mandates, one of our big lenses that we look at legislation. It's great that you want to do this, but perhaps you should pay for it, because local governments across Colorado don't necessarily have abundant resources to pay for programs that, are mandated by the state legislature. And that's been true over the many years. And I think this particular session, started out, it didn't seem like they were going to have a lot of money, and then revenue actually picked up. And we have to be on guard to make sure that those programs are compatible. Counties in particular, we provide the services for the state, whether it's health and human services, elections. I mean, we're the front line. We've been the front line in the pandemic with our public health officers and offices, and the kind of communication that's necessary between state agencies and local governments is another thing that we watch really carefully, because we have to implement those policies that they design in the legislature. So you might imagine we have an opinion about legislation when it's being drafted to make sure it's compatible with the implementation that we do. And so that's always an education process. And with term limits, we're in constant education mode as an association at the legislature, making sure they understand what our function is, what we do, and other things. And of course, there's some big issues in the legislature this time around, and usually are. And there's a transportation package. There's huge amounts of money being spent, on stimulus funds and other things that we keep track of. We try to work as in a partnership with the legislature. That isn't always the easiest thing to accomplish, but we have a can-do attitude about working with them. And sometimes we have to stand up and oppose legislation. And we oppose legislation when it either is an unfunded mandate or it gives us direction that as implementers, we don't think is the right approach. So every session is tough. At least the budget is a lot better than we thought it was going to be a year ago when the pandemic, began. So, it's always rough. I think we provide that local voice, and I think all the local government associations have worked together very well to raise and elevate our voice so that it's heard at the legislature.
Absolutely. Kevin, what about you this session? What's it been looking like for the municipalities in Colorado?
I mean, we always start off with the real basic principle at the statehouse, with both the legislature and the administration: keep local control local and keep home rule at home. Now, a very good friend of mine, former Senate minority leader Andy McElhaney from the region there, once said, "Well, I'm for local control until I'm not." And that's something that we hear a lot down at the State House, although maybe not quite so bluntly and fairly delivered by Andy. But it's true. I mean, it is an education campaign. I feel lucky. I work for an organization that is made up of municipal elected officials. Our membership is that almost every one of them does it because they have time they want to give back to their community. They have full-time jobs doing other things. They certainly don't do it for the pay scale, and they don't do it for the fame, and they certainly don't do it for all the gushing gratitude they get every day from around the community. They do it because they care about their community and they want to work with their colleagues to do the same. We try to bring that spirit to the State House. I would say all the statewide associations of local government do in two ways. As John articulated, we advocate and articulate the impact on local governments of things that the legislature is pushing or promoting, oftentimes also in rulemaking as well, in the agencies. But we also are a resource to the General Assembly and to the administration on local governments. Much in the same way they have a legislative council service that provides information about various things. We view ourselves in very much the same way. And sometimes we have to preface a conversation with legislators. I'm acting as an advocate here, and I'm telling you what you're doing is great or stinks or whatever, and here's why.
Right.
But most of the time, we're trying to supply them with information and have our members also be that voice. The mood, the atmosphere at the State House right now. Look, I spent my first 19 years at CML as a lobbyist, and the last 7 to 10 years leading our advocacy program. And I am telling you, I got out to be executive director at just the right time, because I don't think it's an environment that I can handle. It's a kid's game anymore, but it's also a very difficult, stressful one, just with everything going on. John mentioned transportation. We obviously have a lot of legislation around social justice and police reform that has a lot of impacts. And as you can imagine, we're in the middle of a lot of those. So, difficult, but I know that my staff would say it's also quite rewarding.
No, absolutely. And I know we have quite a few of the Action 22 members and board members who are either county commissioners or mayors or city managers. And I know that they would not be able to do their job as effectively if it wasn't for both of your associations. So let's talk a little bit about American Rescue. Thank you. American Rescue. First off, let's talk about what you see are the differences between this and the CARES Act.
Well, a lot of things. First of all, CARES Act, Congress passed very quickly in a bipartisan way, and then everyone had to try and figure out what it was, what it did, what the rules were, and restrictions. And I guess most disappointingly, provided very little guidance to the states as to how to ensure that the impacts of COVID-19 on local governments were dealt with. So we had to spend a couple months working first within the state, and then several months after that, trying to understand guidelines that were changing constantly, and then go through a process. And our members certainly know a lot about this, and John and I spent a lot of time doing it, helping them figure out what was reimbursable and then getting permission to get it reimbursed. Rube Goldberg would have been proud, and it's no one's fault. It just is what it is. It was very complicated. And now we have the American Rescue Plan Act. John, take a shot at why we see it as a little different ballgame.
Well, I mean, the starting point, I agree with what Kevin said. And the starting point, I think, on the improvement is Kevin and I fought really hard, and we're supported by our congressional delegation, Senator Bennett's office in particular, and on that the local governments get a direct distribution of the funding. So CARES Act for the 5 large city counties and counties got a direct distribution for Treasury for CARES Act, but every other county and municipality had to get their money through the state and through the Department of Local Affairs, and it made it really difficult. And so as they were contemplating, creating this new rescue plan, we were adamant about that the counties and municipalities get a direct distribution of funding. The CARES Act was on a reimbursement basis for those that had to go through the state. So we would get reimbursed for expenses, and we had to supply the information, get reimbursement. So huge improvement that all the counties and most of the municipalities are getting a direct distribution, and that really makes a big difference that we get the money. I think the other thing I think they learned, I think folks at the Treasury Department learned from the CARES Act, and they tried at first blush to get this guidance in a readable format and more understandable than what the CARES Act was. There was a lot of ambiguity in the CARES Act. You know, capital expenditures, let's say that you were a county or a city that had a jail and you were trying, or a courthouse, and you were trying to open that to the public under the guidance of state public health orders, and you needed to make adjustments to that in order to accommodate the public and accommodate the public health order. Well, that's a capital expenditure, and technically it wasn't allowed, except the guidance said under certain circumstances, and that was just nightmarish for our county administrators and city officials to navigate and figure out. So this comes in a lot clearer. We're gonna need more clarity on it as we go forward. But I think the first step was more clarity, and that's really helpful. And it's more flexible. The funding can be used in a more flexible way than the CARES Act, and they kind of leave it, and Kevin and I both appreciate this, I think, to the wisdom of local officials who know their communities really well and know the kind of aid that would be the most useful and most useful ways to spend the money. They're taking advantage of local wisdom and giving us some discretion on how to spend the money. And I think that's also a huge improvement from the kind of CARES Act, Mother May I, that existed. And so huge improvement there. And we worked really hard to get that. And so I think that's a big deal. I also think that you have more time to spend the money. So very importantly, it says that the money needs to be encumbered by December 31st of 2024, but you can expend it through the December 31st of 2026. So if you're working on a long-term project, a broadband long-term project, a housing long-term project, wastewater long-term project, you'll have the time, you won't have to rush it. You'll have the time to actually commit the money by 2024, but you have till 2026 to spend it. So off the top, the huge improvements over how restricted the funding was for CARES Act.
So let me ask you, as you've started to look at these guidelines, and we've seen a lot of movement already in our communities and in our counties about how they're going to spend this and what they're going to do. They were making some assumptions, I think, in some areas of some of those guidelines, which may or may not be correct at this point. As you've seen, and you've seen this movement as well, what are your biggest concerns right now for, and I'll ask you first, Kevin, from the municipality perspective and this money, how they're going to spend it and that coming in, and then John from the county perspective as well.
You know, I think if I were to articulate a concern, and I think it just provides an opportunity for patience and caution, is that because of that time frame, and because we're now looking at the guidance and understanding it in the context of other federal programs that are out there, as well as state dollars that may be available, as well as potential partnerships with special districts or other local governments. Anyone who's asked me of my membership, and maybe some that haven't asked me, have been telling them, slow your roll. Don't make any big decisions too soon, because you may miss an opportunity to utilize dollars for greater impact than if you spend them right now. Certainly to be able to combine them with other funding to leverage them, use them as matching dollars against other things. And so I'm aware of some of my members that made some early decisions based on what they thought was going to be the case. Some cases it might work out, in some cases it may not. But I really want to encourage folks and those working with local governments to take time, first of all, to see what can't be done or shouldn't be done, and then start exploring what the options and opportunities are. there's some very low hanging fruit, some very explicit language like around infrastructure, water, wastewater, broadband, and the partnerships are innumerable there. But some of the other allowances within the relief fund certainly lend themselves to taking the time to have a conversation both internally and with local, state, and federal partners to determine the best ways to spend dollars.
So just take a beat. You don't have to be rushed on this. Let's do it right. This is the only time this is going to happen, that we can assume that this is going to happen. So just, it's fine. You can take a breath and figure it out.
Yeah, and this is John. I agree with that. I think we're saying the same thing to counties essentially. And I think it's important to realize that the local government distribution, what's coming to municipalities and to counties, there's an enormous amount of money that comes through the state. Some of that money the governor will distribute, and some of the money will go through the legislative process. So it's taking the time to look at all that money. And Kevin and I have been really clear when we've had productive conversations with the state about, hey, in those areas where there's an overlap, this is a local priority, but it's also the state is going to prioritize this as well. Then let's break down the stovepipes and really have a conversation about this funding working together. And our premise has been, obviously the local governments will set their priorities, but when they're in common with how the state is going to spend their money, then we ought to be working together. And we've done some things where we're talking about moving the existing CARES Act committee into an American Relief Act committee to just talk about willing partnerships. So, and on any of these infrastructure needs, and you look at it and you think, okay, the local government has a seat at the table because they got their own money, but they can work then with the state agencies and with the governor's office and others and look at opportunities to make their money grow. So that if they got that amount of money, if we can double or triple that with an investment from those state pots of money, we can really get some significant work done. And I think Kevin's right. Let's take the time and see where that additional funding is. And there are also cases where money outside of this Relief Act, other federal money, which is why we're engaged with the congressional delegation, where other pots of money can be leveraged too in existing programs. There's an existing broadband funding stream. There's an existing wastewater funding stream. And can we bring all those things to the table and do something significant?
So that's going to be the interesting part, to get everybody together at the table. What are your strategies right now on that? Because that's something for Action 22 that we're really deeply concerned about. We want you guys to be the resources, but we know the importance right now is to start to get everybody together, not just municipalities and their counties, but neighboring counties and municipalities, and that regional lift that it's going to be. What is going to be your strategy on that?
Well, I mean, John brings up a really good point about collaboration. Look, the regional associations, particularly with that span, local government, business, et cetera, have your finger on the pulse of regional issues. That's going to be really critical for any statewide organization or discussion to occur. John mentioned something else, and I just want to underscore it. The state also has its allocation of ARP funds too, $4 billion. And now we haven't decided how the state should spend its money yet, but we're going to give them some suggestions. And there are lots of areas of crossover, like John mentioned, water, wastewater, broadband, affordable housing, business assistance, et cetera. There are a lot of areas that where local governments, businesses, the state government, and our federal partners, even as John mentioned as well, we've all got similar interests. So if the regional associations, regional organizations are also having that conversation locally as well, it's going to inure to everyone's benefit. And especially since I don't think the state I think it's going to be a little bit before the state figures out how it's going to spend its dollars. John mentioned between the executive branch and the legislative branch, they'll sort that out on the state's allocation. But it may very well be leading up to and in the next legislative session through the normal appropriations process, which is great. We got time to have the conversation.
John?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say that the value of the, regional effort, I want to underscore that because regardless what we're talking about, Kevin and I have also been working on the opioid settlement and providing services. We need that regional look because you can't put infrastructure everywhere, but infrastructure for mental health and stuff and things like that should be accessible by people in rural areas, for example. But the only way to do that is to look at that in a regional level, which is what Action 22, Club 20, and these other regional organizations are really important to facilitate those conversations because they're critical. I mean, throughout the whole opioid settlement discussion, we were like, it's self-determination. Those regions should form because of the conversations that the elected officials and their citizens are having in those regions. They should decide what the best fit is. That's not something a state association should tell them how it's going to be structured or state government. Those regional conversations are absolutely critical to identifying needs and ways that you can collaborate and work together. We're going to depend heavily on groups like Action 22, having those conversations, kind of aggregating all the demands and making a recommendation from a regional perspective as well. So I wanted to underscore that.
Thank you both. We're very much looking forward to doing that conversation. When we come back from the break, I want to start unpacking some of the specifics of those guidelines, if that's okay with you guys. We'll return in just a few minutes.
Hi, well, I'm going to take over for a minute here.
Yeah.
So one thing that was mentioned the last half hour was how important it is for these regional organizations to kind of get out there. One thing that I've noticed through my years of working in this is that sometimes the rural districts, rural counties, they're a little bit slower in getting information and getting organized. And that's why it's important for organizations like CCI, CML, and Action 22, Pro 15, Club 20. But what you mentioned about these regional organizations talking to everyone, making sure everybody's on the same page. With CCI and CML, you're dealing primarily with the local elected officials, county commissioners, mayors, city council. With Action 22, we deal with them as well, but along with the business, individual members. And I think that's really important. And I like that you said that it's going to be kind of our job to make everybody on the same page in our region, not just the local elected officials, but the business owners, the associations that are in our area, the farmers, anything. And I really appreciate that. And I think that's where organizations such as ours can step into on a regional level and make sure that these voices are heard and get everybody organized on the same page.
So let's talk a little bit, and I know you guys both agree with that, because especially for the rural, so let's say it this way, because you guys serve the counties and municipalities regardless of size. What are you guys doing, or what is the best thing that you guys can think of to do to some of your smaller ones that are not as involved with you as maybe some of your larger ones?
Well, in terms of municipalities, and this might be a slight contradiction, John, to something you said earlier, most municipalities are not getting their American Rescue Plan Act dollars directly from U.S. Treasury. Municipalities that are under 50,000 are non-entitlement units of local government, according to the Act. And so there's a lot of concern first before the guidelines and before anyone really read the Act that, oh my God, it's going to be CARES all over again. We're going to have to, go begging to the state to get dollars. That's not the case. And while Treasury has not finished guidelines for the the non-entitlement local governments just yet. Those are the one piece that wasn't included in this. We know enough to know that the state will pass through those dollars. The state can't hang on to the dollars, and the state can't offset the dollars in some other way. The amounts that municipalities, because I think they're all municipalities that will be in the non-entitlement group, the amounts that they're set to receive are set. They'll be set by U.S. Treasury, and unlike CARES, and this didn't happen in Colorado, but in other states, state governments just flat out didn't pass any money along, or if they did, they reduced other shared revenue that they had with local governments. And the American Rescue Plan Act clearly prohibits any of the shenanigans like that from going on. So most of my members by number are not only under 50,000, most of them are under 1,000 population. A big chunk of those on the Eastern Plains, some in the mountains, some in certainly in Action 22's coverage area. And so to me, they're as important. It doesn't matter if it's Denver or Dove Creek, everyone in between, they're going to get treated the same in terms of making sure they're getting the full services of the league, and not just, representation on this, but anything else.
Yeah, I think there's only 2 municipalities in the Action 22 footprint that are 50,000 or more. There's only 2, and it's Pueblo and Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's going to be a really big deal. John, is it different for the size? Is there a size thing that is attached with counties getting their money?
No, every county is getting a direct distribution, and will set up a direct account with the Treasury Department. So,
will that be based on population?
No, all 64 counties in the state will get a direct distribution of funding from the U.S. Treasury. It won't go through the state.
Oh, what I mean is on the funding itself, is the amount that they're getting based on their population?
That's one of the determinants of it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Very good. All right. So when you started to look at these guidelines, and this is a question for both of you, when you started to look at the guidelines on Monday afternoon when they came out, what were the first things that struck you about them?
Well, number one, it was 150 pages. And so it's going to be a late night. So I think one of the things that struck me is we'd learned a lot since the CARES Act. I thought that it was well done. There are still some ambiguities that we need clarity on, but I thought it was well done. And just a comment about the smaller counties that I have. I actually spend more time with my smaller counties because they don't have the same level of staffing. They have every one of our staff members on our cell phones on direct dial, and we work hard with them. We also work with the DOLA regional folks to make sure that, a county administrator, some of our counties, that's it for staff. And they may have a health and human services director and other things, but they're it, and they need support. And so one of the innovative ways we have supported them is a clearinghouse where, for example, on CARES Act, Otero County came up with the best way to get money out to businesses. So we use that format to put out to the other counties, and this is how Otero County figured it out. It's a good path forward. And so they didn't have to recreate the wheel. One person working on this doesn't have to create the wheel, but rather can edit that and modify it to fit their county. It's really helpful. And what that really is, we're a facilitator for counties helping counties.
Right.
County administrators helping county administrators, that kind of thing. We facilitate that. So back to the guidance, I think the key thing when I read it was really distinguish the pages that matter in that thing are basically 130 or 130 through 150. That's what you want to read. That's okay. That's the meat. And the other thing is distinguish between the terms of art. Shall is important. And then recommend is, you don't have to do it, but it's recommended that you do it. So
sure.
looking at that with that lens, you really get to the meat of it pretty quickly, but it's enormously flexible. There is some confusion in there, but we'll be able to, the counties and municipalities will be able to design this in a way to meet their needs, I believe. And it also gives you the ability to replace revenue losses and other things that the CARES Act didn't. So I was encouraged by the guidance when I saw it.
So to dumb it down for somebody like me, where it says, here's $5, you shall spend that on a vehicle. That means you spend it on a vehicle. Here's $5, we recommend you spend it on a vehicle, but you don't have to. Is that basically what you're saying?
And the other thing that's in there is they give a list of uses, but they say it's not limited to that list.
Ah, very good.
Which gives a community, every community in our state is different. And it gives them an ability to modify this to fit the needs of their community. And I think it does, well, CARES Act was really restrictive, but it gives people a chance to be, creative, meet with their communities and try to meet some of those most acute needs. And it has enough categories in it that I think, and infrastructure possibilities that I think every community can tailor this in a way that fits their needs.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll tell you the thing I looked to first is, and this is a very short list, is what's prohibited.
Yeah.
What can't it be used for? And the act was pretty clear. The rule, the interim rule, and the guidance that supports it is even more clear. You can't use it to offset a tax cut. So if you're anticipating revenue, be it a local government or a state government, and you cut your income taxes, you can't supplant that revenue reduction with this money. You can't use it to backfill pensions.
Okay.
Period. End of story. So those are completely off the table. So not too much of a surprise there, because that was that was fairly well articulated, even through the legislative process. But we've talked about the infrastructure. I think the infrastructure is crystal clear between water, wastewater, and broadband, and that obviously has a lot of impacts. As previously mentioned, it's going to be important to piggyback with the state and other resources to be able to maximize those dollars. No, not too many municipalities are going to be able to take even 100% of their allocation and be able to resolve, if they have to build a new drinking water treatment plant or a wastewater plant. It's not going to work like that. But beyond that, and I think of interest to the broader community that municipalities and counties support is, and I think similar themes to what was in the CARES Act, but with much more clarity and fewer restrictions, are dealing with the costs of public health response, both at the governmental level, but also business and community impacts as well, addressing economic impacts. I mentioned business assistance programs. There's a whole host of nonprofits out there that support at-risk communities and others, and they're certainly going to be eligible to partner with municipalities, counties, and the state to utilize funds. I think what struck me was it provides a much greater network to be able to pull together support across a broad spectrum. And again, that just underscores that need for those conversations, not just within any one entity, local government or otherwise, talking to itself, but with private sector and nonprofit partners in both within the community and statewide.
Is there a matching component to any of this funding for the American Rescue Plan?
Well, one of the things you can't do is you can't use this for a match for a federal program that requires a non-federal match. So for example, traditionally, a lot of the federal programs, FEMA has waived their match most recently, but they require 25% non-federal match. So in those federal, if you're seeking additional federal funds, those that require a non-federal match, this money would not qualify for that. However, I think where the matching possibilities really are is in matching these different pots of American Rescue Plan funding. So we could match, a local, Pueblo County could take their money and invest it in one of the infrastructure areas, and they could seek additional American Relief Act money coming from the state to do that. That kind of matching is allowed. But if there are specific federal programs outside of this relief plan that have that requirement of a non-federal match, then you couldn't do it there.
So like if you had an EDA grant that required a 25% non-federal match, you can't use the funds allocated to either municipality or a county to meet that other 25%.
Correct.
Okay. What about, and I'm going to get confused really quickly on this. So the federal funds that are going to go to the state are completely separate pot. But then can you also apply to the federal beyond what you would apply to for the state on projects? Or is it's going to the states and that's, you've got to go through the state is it basically the money that's going to the state should be considered federal dollars?
No, well, I mean, the money, the entire package of federal dollars is being distributed to states, local governments, and tribal governments. So the state has its share, municipalities and counties have their share. However, that does not mean that the state can't use some of its share to support programs where a municipality or county may also be using some of its share. Let me give you an example, because this is one I think we're going to see, certainly one we're advocating for in a couple different areas. We mentioned water and wastewater infrastructure. So that's obviously regulated. The Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act are administered in Colorado by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's Water Quality Control Division. We want to see some of that money that the state has, particularly go to smaller communities that have so much difficulty in affording the $1 million, $10 million plants that and fixes that are required, that then have to turn to businesses and ratepayer and citizens to support higher rates to be able to pay them off. It just doesn't work out. So We'd like to see, and for the goal of clean water, safe drinking water, we think that's a great partnership with state and local governments. Obviously, businesses factor into that as well, because the permit fees that are used to support division activities often go up when costs go up. And so there's definitely a benefit there. Another area that that we've already asked is, and this is going a little bit back in time, but I think folks remember during the Great Recession, when the state was looking to preserve as much of its budget as possible, as we were hemorrhaging revenue all over the place, cash funds all over the place were being used to backfill the state budget. One of them was the Energy Impact Assistance Grant Fund that severance tax goes into, and it eviscerated the fund for municipalities and counties to deal with the impacts of energy extraction and other community type things. We want to see some of that money restored. This is a great opportunity, and particularly since so much of that revenue goes into county and municipal infrastructure that just hasn't been at a level it should have been had those dollars not been taken way back then. So we'll see, but those are the kind of things we're already advocating. Again, we don't get to tell the state where to spend their money, but we're definitely going to advocate where we see a strong nexus with both state and local interests that go just beyond the governmental thing, but I think also impact businesses and citizens as well.
And to your point, Sarah, there was another relief package that was passed, in December of last year, prior to this. And so when you ask, are there things we could ask the federal government for? These state pots of ARP funding will be, the state will, in consultation with the legislature, will decide how to spend these funds. But those other funds that are out there in federal programs are ones that we could apply for as local governments or apply for money. And some of that money also went through the state, and we can ask for additional money there as well. So there are things we can ask the federal government for in addition, which is one of the reasons we are spending time with our federal delegation, especially, but in the process of identifying a critical infrastructure need or a critical community need, and then looking for every bit of money we can find to actually build something sustainable. I mean, it does us no good to provide mental health services that we can't maintain over a period of time.
Correct.
The value in it is that it's sustainable over a period of time and people can rely on it. And we can pull these pots of money together to create that resiliency and sustainability in some of these areas.
And for those that are taking notes, I mean, some of those other funds, capital projects funds, homeowner assistance fund, emergency rental assistance programs, state small business credit initiative, and of course, our favorite, the coronavirus relief fund, which is part of the CARES Act.
So when you've been having these discussions with the state, and they're going to be different discussions than I'm going to be having, but when you've been having these discussions with the state, what has been the response? How's that landed? Do you feel like it's going to be?
It's early, Sarah. I mean, we're just we're planting seeds, and we'll sprinkle a little water on it and see what grows. Like I said, we don't know when they're going to start making their decisions yet. They're early in the process, they being the state leaders in both the administration and legislative leadership. Are they going to have a special session? There was certainly talk of that at some point. Some of the discussions I've had make me believe that maybe dollars that there's agreement that will be custodial dollars under the governor's control. He may make some decisions and some announcements like he did with the CARES Act dollars, certainly in the months ahead. But the General Assembly may wait until, like I said, until they go through the legislative process. It will begin this fall, and then with appropriations during the legislative session starting in January. So there's still a lot of question marks. All we can do, John and I, is try to be as helpful as possible with things that our friends in the administration and legislative leadership ought to consider, and the benefit that they would have, not just to state programs, but also where there's that great state local nexus, again, in public sector, but also in supporting businesses and nonprofits in our communities as well.
Go ahead, John.
If I could just follow up with one quick point. And one thing Kevin and I both realize, I mean, we're largely facilitators in a lot of ways. The power of our advocacy comes from our members. They don't want to hear Kevin and I testify.
Right.
The power is when we get local officials that are passionate about these issues and we help them advocate. But boy, there's no more powerful voice than a unified group of local public officials. And we rely on them heavily. They are CCI and CML. We do the job, but they are the organization, and their advocacy makes the difference.
I don't even want to self-testify, so.
We feel exactly the same way about our membership, so I get that. So here's how we're going to leave it with everybody right this minute. My big takeaway from today is take your time. I'd really like to see the legislature and the executive branch do the same. And that let's be open to discussion. And that's what we're going to do for Action 22 and working with you guys and making sure that we can help all those convene. And so I really appreciate it. Really just really quick, 30 seconds. If you were the king for the day, what would be the first project you would do? Kevin?
I'd backfill the Energy Impact Assistance Program. Those dollars go out to communities that need it. It would right a wrong that happened back in the late 2000s in draining those funds, and let's get some infrastructure built with it.
Perfect. John, 30 seconds, your project.
I second Kevin's because
I love it.
it would right a wrong, and a promise is a promise, and the state government made the promise that they were temporarily taking that money because of a crisis, and they would replenish it at a later date, and I think they need to keep that promise.
I love it. I love it.
And they can look good doing it.
They could look good doing it. So next week we're going to be in Trinidad. We're going to be doing some, we're going to actually be having our annual meeting down there in October, but next week, join us, we'll be in Trinidad. Hey, Chad Forthman, I know you're listening right now. What the hell, Chad? This session has been crazy. I need you to quit using the force inappropriately and start using it for good. We're just way too into it. We need all the Jedi on deck right now. So just knock it off. So join us next week when I ask a whole lot of overly complicated questions. And Brian McCain is going to walk us through how a 2-year fight to get magic tricks and illusionist curriculum in schools is finally paying off. We will see you next week.